My name's Jeff. I'm going to take you through pretty much what was just explained. It's quite provocative. It's very direct. It's based on a personal viewpoint. The personal viewpoint has been the start of our business, the reason the business started. And it's about, it's interesting to listen to the panel because we talked about top line, we talked about a very high level element of FM, workplace, well-being. You know, FM also goes very granular. It goes down to how we get a light bulb replaced. And the whole thing is part of the foundation of facilities management. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is a smaller part of the bigger subject of FM. So just to kick it off, my background is I'm an engineer. I was trained as a refrigeration engineer. Was on the tools, felt what it was like on the ground. So that was sort of a good foundation for what we were going to build because I'd actually been there, seen it and got the t-shirt. I've been in FM for 35 years, starting off with the engineering side of it, and I was lucky enough to be one of the last people that were very well trained before training started to disappear. And then I also, through my career, found working with different businesses from various sizes, owner managed, and eventually got a taste of the corporate world at ISS. And what I found was a lot of common elements through the businesses, from whether they be small, medium or large. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background on us because it will frame what we're going to talk about. So we started a business back in 2011, we're only 5 years old. We now look after 6,000 odd buildings across the UK and Europe. We manage 1,400 restaurants out of those 6,000 buildings, and that will become relevant as we go through again. We find restaurants are very emotional, very demanding part of the market. And these are some of the clients that we look after. We're a blue chip client-seeking business, and it's enabled us to sort of be quite instrumental in influencing by being directly involved with these clients. We also employ 150 engineers, but it's a different model to what most people would think, that you're going into a self-delivery. We don't self-deliver. Those guys are purely for statutory compliance. We have a supply chain that we manage that look after the various day-to-day stuff, and within that supply chain they manage and they obviously own or employ 7,000 engineers. And it's 280 suppliers, but interestingly 80 of those suppliers deliver 85% of our workload. So the rest is through specialisms and so on. We have three divisions: facilities management, which is basically managing that supply chain to deliver services to our clients, and service delivery, which essentially is the 150 guys doing the statutory compliance, and consultancy. We look at a technical solution and innovation for our clients that may or may not be someone that we physically service. It's a consultancy function. So, and this is where it gets a little bit bold. Our view after many years in FM, we felt that it wasn't quite doing what it's supposed to do, what the intentions were. And we didn't want it to become the next double glazing fiasco. That was the way we interpreted it. So it needs to be strong, respected and robust. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be high performing. But to do either of those things, we believe absolutely it has to be transparent. We should be attracting talent naturally, and again, there's a number of functions around that. There's the workplace, the well-being, all those other things. And a good example was, do you show the employee around your offices to see, if that's going to help secure their talent? And how many of us in our careers have we seen the merry-go-round? And my background is refrigeration and supermarket industry from when I was trained. And I've watched it go insourced, outsourced, insourced, outsourced. You start getting dizzy. So why is there that movement? Why does that happen? So this is why we believe it happens. We carried out, or we commissioned a survey, third-party company with the BIFM. And we interviewed, or they interviewed, 150 senior FMs in the FTSE 250, 350 industry. And there were some interesting outcomes. Everyone agreed that FM was very, very important within their organisation. but only 15% said their organisation actually valued it to a great extent. That's quite concerning. 51% said it was slightly valued or not at all. So it's another interesting statistic. But the real big one was only 11% trusted their FM provider. That's quite a fundamental statement. It's quite a fundamental realisation that there's a problem. And we can all close our eyes to it and just carry on doing the same thing, or we can look at doing something different. But the first thing we have to do is understand the problem before you can create a solution. So I'm just going to go through over the next sort of 20 minutes on how we believe we can change this and how we are actually in our business changing it, and we've seen the positive results of that change. So what's our main challenges? Lots of you, I'm sure, in presentations have seen the iceberg. You know, it's about we need to control budget and spend. We need the client to help the client control budget and spend. We need the client to help manage and understand the operational performance, their statutory compliance. And you know, we have a challenge now where all that happens with suppliers, typically the perception is they have a hammer applied to them every single time there's a change in rate requirement. And one of the reasons that these are challenges to us is that in our space of whether it be hard or soft FM, the volume of activity within a client is huge, and no one's ever really got to grips with how to manage that volume, to report on it, to understand it. And everyone's always been backward looking. Everyone always backward looks. And when you're backward looking and you can see that something's gone wrong or something's not quite right, there isn't really the motivation to do anything about it, because it's gone now. We can't change what's happened. We can only shape what's going to happen. So there's all these things that happen about hourly rates and asset management and procurement focus and all those different things, but yet under the surface there's all these other things happening that we all know are there, but we don't really address them. We don't really focus on a sustainable solution. So that by default creates a high risk relationship. Your relationship is immediately under pressure, whether it from the supply chain or the provider and the client. And because that relationship is not in a trusting environment and it's under pressure, by default that blocks innovation, it blocks strategy, it blocks the belief in each other's ability or capabilities. And then of course it creates delivery stress. Everything's under pressure, everything's under a watchful eye. Everyone's actually trying now to, you've got a breakdown in relationship, you're on the divorce path. And that's something that I've seen frequently across all of the different businesses I've worked in with client relationship, and that contributes to the merry-go-round of insource, outsource, insource, outsource. And it also makes it hard to measure. Suppliers have historically set the metrics. There'll be a lot of clients that argue that actually no, we set the metrics, and that's true of course. But of course it's how are those metrics reported. Lots of you will hear people say, and rightfully so, that people can shape statistics in whatever way they want to deliver the message they want to deliver. We'll argue that. We'll absolutely agree that that's what happens when you haven't got a clear set of metrics to measure against. If you have a common set of metrics, then statistics will only show what statistics show. But if you allow people to move the metrics and adjust the metrics and have a different viewpoint of those metrics, then clearly you have a different output. So therefore statistics will show what you want it to show. And of course, the other thing that happens when you are in a stressed relationship, the client will have hundreds of stakeholders, in some cases thousands of stakeholders, and those stakeholders have all got a voice. And that creates noise, and noise is one of the biggest challenges FM providers have to manage. Noise from their client base, noise from stakeholders within the client base. Some founded, some unfounded, but nevertheless it's there. Perception is reality. So what do we end up with? My favourite term, smoke and mirrors. We started Cloudfm because we believed that the industry was full of smoke and mirrors through our experience, and we needed to address it. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an insight as to my experience, and I've been client side for a short time but predominantly been service provider side. And this has been my experience with my colleagues, not my personal experience necessarily, although I have endured it, but I'd go into a monthly review meeting, quarterly review meeting, strategy meeting with a client, as would most of my colleagues in all the businesses I've worked in, and they would take in their management information pack. And they're going to share that with a client, and they're going to talk about it and deliver their messages. And they would also take the computer. And the other thing they used to take was Yellow Pages. And that used to be stuffed down the back of their trousers, because what was going to happen was there was going to be a kick-in. And you know, as funny as that may seem, if you speak, and have spoken to, and I certainly have, you have to go a long way to find somebody that says, I have a fantastic meeting with my client every month. I have a great meeting. I come out full of excitement. I come out full of praise. It's not as frequent as it should be, and that's quite scary. So why can't we trust the information and the data? What's the most common denominator? There's huge amount of manual activity in FM. And I'm now talking more about the hard FM and the delivery of services rather than the wellbeing side. The administration, the people, the number of people involved in a process, and I'm going to take you through a few examples. And because of that, when you've got people involved, you have an emotional content. You also have an interpretation, none of which is consistent. There is an inconsistency. So therefore, what do we all think we're going to get? Do we think we're going to get consistent results when you've got inconsistencies in the process? Adding people, it just adds inconsistency and risk. Processes, clearly we all know about processes. Some are good, some are bad, some are rubbish, some are flawed. And of course it's about being able to identify how strong those processes are. But what gets measured is selective. We can all be very selective. We walk into a meeting and a client's going to say, you're not compliant. I'm going to walk in there and try and convince him he is compliant. Because I'm going to be very selective on the information I'm going to give him. That's the environment of which we've created. That's the environment of which we work in, because of the consequences of not doing what the client expects you to do. And visibility comes too late. And because it's too late, as I said, we're looking backwards. There's a lack of motivation to do anything because you can't affect what's happened. So here's an example. Visibility from top to bottom. Most people in this room will understand and would have appreciated and would have experienced that you'll have a service provider, you'll have a service provider that will employ a subcontractor, and a subcontractor employ another subcontractor, and eventually an engineer turns up onto the shop floor of that building. But no one's got any visibility of that. No one can see what that guy's doing, what he's capable of doing, or that lady. No one's understands their skill sets and whether they're a plumber or electrician and whether they should have been a plumber or electrician. So everything's very trusting in that process. And you actually don't know the outcome for a day, a week, a month. And invariably, my experience has been clients saying to me, you know, I can ask a question about when my fridge was fixed, or when my air conditioner was fixed, or when the projector was replaced. Can you tell me if that's working? And we get back to you in a couple of weeks, because it takes that long to find out. It's just ridiculous. But that's the life we live in the main. And what we're saying is that as a result of that, that's a starting point of mistrust. You've got all that movement of activity and paperwork and reconciliation from the guy that's on the shop floor through all of those chains until it gets to the client. By default, the client will say automatically, without even looking at it, I'm not sure I trust this, but you haven't even looked at it yet. But the client is right to not trust it because he can't see it. It's not visible. And if it's not visible, you can't manage it. So what you need to create, in our view, is if you're going to create a trusting environment, you have to start at the very basic and at the very bottom. You have to get your foundation right. And your foundation must be, there has to be visibility. The man or the woman on the shop floor carrying out their activities must be seen by all relevant stakeholders. The contractor, the provider, the client must be able to see that information. And if you want to be really good, you want to see it in real time. And then you take away any of the challenges. And then suddenly you open up a whole new world. And that's been our experience, which is why we exist and why we're doing what we're doing. So here's an example. I'm not going to ask you to read the boxes. I can't read them, I'll stand right next to it. But what this is designed to try and show you is from the top, from the point of saying my boiler is not working, to actually getting an invoice, there's all these potential steps that take part in that one simplistic job. And all those things are real. We've not made that up to make it look good. Every single one of those things happen from when a client says, fix my boiler, to when he or she gets an invoice. And the typical control points are here. This is what the manual process, this is what FM, in every experience we've had, these are the points that are measured. And by default, you can see how many points are not measured. And therefore, that creates risk. It creates risk and it creates a lack of visibility. The points that should be measured are these. And of course, that would become incomprehensible because the natural response is, I've got to employ 30,000 more people to manage those points. Well, no, you use technology. Technology manages those points in a consistent and unemotional methodology. So only with the correct data do you have the chance of actually controlling the failure points. And it's controlling the failure points that will create an improvement in service. So, how do we do that? So this comes back down to my statistics discussion a few moments ago. Every client that we've ever been engaged with will have a view on what SLAs and KPIs and performance measurements should be. But there's even massive interpretation in every one of those lines. So therefore, the measurement and the control in the output becomes untrustworthy because there's an interpretation. What you've got to do is you have to remove interpretation. We have to create something that's real. So what is a first-time fix? I asked this question in debate about 6 months ago, and I asked it from a room of about 15, 20 contractors. And I got 15 and 20 different versions of what a first-time fix is. That, by default, shows the challenge. And if you've got those different interpretations, then it's smoke and mirrors. What constitutes an attendance and a completion? Do we measure our performance on how quick we get there, or do we measure our performance on how quick we complete and we fix the work? If we do it on attendance, we create the wrong behaviour because someone sends a courier along on a motorbike to say I've arrived but I can't do the job, but I've met my attendance KPIs. So what are we going to do to improve on what we do? What is the criteria for benchmarking costs? You know, everyone's got a view of how you control costs, and we've agreed a markup, but have we got an army of policemen that's checking every single cost coming through when you've got thousands of invoices a week? The reality is it's ineffective. And there's opportunity for failure, opportunity for mistake, error, human error, and opportunity for potentially doing things you shouldn't be doing. And then what is a recall and what's a warranty? When is it a recall? When is it a warranty? Again, all different interpretations. So whatever happens, you have to start, in our view, with a common set of measurements. We need eyes on the person doing the work. And essentially, we need to understand what those measurements need to be. They need to be a common set of understandings of what all this actually means. There is no debate about what a first-time fix is. There is no debate about what a completion is. There is no debate about the time it should take between a revisit and so on. And there should be no debate about recalls and warranties. When you've got that as a standard that everybody measures against, suddenly you remove the ability for statistics to say what you want it to say, because it can only say the same thing, provided your data is correct. So it's not a particularly good badge, but that's an idea of indication of what a standard, you know, creating a standard against which we can all measure. And of course, in addition to that, once you've got the standard, you need a much better data set, but you need a data set that you can trust. And one of the things that's been revolutionary in our business is, in the 5 years we've been operating, not one client has ever said on one situation, but I'm not really sure how long he was on site, and I'm not really sure he actually went there that day. There has never once been a challenge, because the technology we use removes any doubt that that person was there for that period of time. And that creates a massive leap forward in trust. And suddenly you're having a completely different debate with your client. Suddenly I can leave the yellow pages at home. And it has to be based on the standard. And then once we can compare performance, we can then gain traction and start making and effecting change. And of course, when you've got great data, you've got the ability to now predict. We've talked about the GSK and the weather vanes, predicting what the weather's going to be 24 hours in advance. That's great when you can actually do that, because it becomes effective. So we need to do the same thing in all parts of the FM industry, from the part I'm talking about today, from soft services, well-being, all those things. If we've got great data, we get great predictions. And of course, that cliche that says, if you can't measure it, how can you possibly manage it? How can you possibly react to something you don't understand? So it is about creating the metrics that you can actually then measure against. And of course, real-time data is important. You've got to create, and you've got to remove the barriers. most of you, I'm sure, will be aware that you've got people like Chubb Alarms and the bigger businesses and the Integrals of the world that have got large workforces. They will have their own software and methodology of managing, and they'll have their own hardware for a PDA of a type that communicates with their system. And that's great from within their businesses. But from a client perspective, a client will always have to bring in multiple service capability. So what we need to do is establish a facility that says everybody has got access at zero cost or very little cost. And the mobile phone fulfills that opportunity, the smartphone. Which means everybody can collaborate, whether they're a 2-man band or they're a 2,000-man band. You have a common, simplistic methodology that helps you and helps the supply chain comply and gives you visibility that you've never had before. So when you hear me talk about the beginning, we're managing 7,000 engineers. We are not responsible for 7,000 engineers, they're employees of other companies. But we can see what every one of those employees is doing every time on one of our sites. And we give that information to our supply chain as well, at no cost, because there is no cost. But you've suddenly opened up a world of information that is 100% trustworthy. That's the key. And again, we're back to interpretation. When is a job raised? Some people will say, a supplier will say, well, it's raised when I get it. Well, no, it isn't. It was raised an hour ago. The fact that there was a delay from when you got it is not the client's issue. The client raised it an hour ago. It's about interpretation. And when does a job physically start? Is it when the engineer arrives, or is it when he says hello to the manager or the building manager? When is it that, these measurements, you find that because of the environment we create, everybody's trying to find a way to not take the yellow pages into the room. So therefore, they will interpret in a way in which helps them try and deliver a fact that they didn't really fail. Because that's the environment we've created. We need to create greater transparency. Someone said to us as a supplier, on a 4-hour call, if I get there in 4 hours and 1 minute, does that mean I've missed my SLA? And the answer is, did you get there in 4 hours? He said, yeah, but it's only 1 minute. So I said, but is it 4 hours? When are you going to get a data set that says I can measure what you did and you didn't do? I'm not going to ask you to bring your yellow pages in because you was a minute late, but let's all accept and agree the fact you was a minute late. It's simple. It's not complicated. So again, it's all back to quality data, trustworthy data, non-negotiable data, and a huge and important data set that's trustworthy. And then you measure against the metrics that have been set. Now, this metric doesn't exist at the moment. It's one of the things that we're talking to BIF about to say, how do we go about getting a set of metrics that the industry recognises and measures against? And then you get common measurement. And it also needs to be simple, and it needs to be almost fully automated. Some things I say often is that when you introduce humans into a process, you introduce risk. So remove humans as much as reasonably possible, and you create consistency, and you create a lack of risk or reduced risk. At that point, you can genuinely deliver value when you've got this information, because you can react appropriately. So you can also improve your governance, and it's visible, it's transparent. In our environment, any service provider that works with us or through us for a client, they get paid by the minute, not by the half hour or the hour or the rounded up. You was there for 17 minutes, you're going to get paid 17 minutes. So it's about absolute clarity on what you're doing across the board, one set of rules. And it's about clearer SLAs. It's about superior warranty and recall management. But here's an example I use. It's a little bit high level, but in terms of sort of staying up at the top. But one of the things I've experienced throughout my career as a contractor trying to sell services is contractor A goes through a procurement process and they charge 20 quid an hour, and a contractor charges £35 an hour. Procurement have never had any other measurement other than an hourly rate, so they've had to do it like that. But in actual fact, the best value was the 35 quid. But they couldn't measure that. We now can measure that. We can measure the specific value of a contractor with our rich data sets. So we can show and demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt which contractor offers a greater value. We don't have to go through a tender process to establish that. And then, of course, there's benchmarking, and there's a thing we have called maximum price protocol, which basically means a supplier will give a client a quote for 2,000 quid based upon this labour and this material. But when they actually do the work, they only get paid for the material they've used and the actual labour they've used. So therefore, you've got even greater control. The benefit to the supply chain is they get to win every single job that the client wants to deliver, because we are managing to the minute with total visibility. So trust is established. And then, of course, you've got compliance. Compliance is the one thing that can't be fully automated. Compliance is a great function in terms of information, but unfortunately, in our experience, most clients' expectations of what their compliance is tends to be something quite substantially different when they go into a detailed and in-depth, deep dive audit. Compliance does need to have technical competence with eyes on that claimed compliance to establish what is true compliance. We've seen clients that have declared themselves as 80–90% compliant that have actually ended up being 28% compliant, because although they had compliance certification and documentation, that compliance actually said you're not compliant, but no one read it. And it's amazing how many of those failures are taking place. And it needs putting the technical expertise in the right place and competence looking at compliance. And then the big data set, we're back to big data, you're in the buzzword. In our world, we have cube capability where we can look at multi-dimensional data, which sees trends, it sees predictions. It enables us to offer information that we would put our lives on because of the quality of our data. Something that, again, we never experienced before. And then suddenly we've got the ability to make great decisions. With great information comes great decisions and de-risk decisions. But most of all, we establish what I pointed out on slide 2. We've now established trust. We are not challenged in any of the areas that we've been challenged for the last 30 years. All of that's gone away, and it now becomes a more productive and engaging relationship. And then, of course, with all that data, you then get to see the world how it really is. You know, when you get that visibility, we have to prepare our clients and say, are you prepared for this information? Because you need to be prepared for the information, because it won't be what you're expecting. And once you are, no matter how good or bad it is, at least we know what it is, so we can now react, we can now address it. But most of all, that relationship in its trusting basis, we can now actually start understanding and exercising a true partnership, and not use the word partnership because it's a buzzword. It's a true, meaningful partnership, and it's got longevity. We have some case studies, which is all over our website, but it's basically backing up all the things we've been saying, how we've done this with these clients and how they've reaped the rewards. You won't hear us turn around and say, we can save you loads of money. The reality is our level of control and management and governance, the byproduct is your costs are reduced. What we then find is that our clients, after year 1 and 2 of enjoying that cost reduction, then reinvest that back in to improve their estates and their buildings. So it essentially means, but what they've now got, which they've never had, is absolute visibility. You can't measure what you can't see. All the things that we've talked about, and one of the things that's really important that I've gone through for 30 minutes now talking about what our business and our culture is about. It's a big subject with lots of challenges. People will challenge certain things that we've said, and that's fine. We have a thing that says, how do we summarise the 4-hour debate on what we do that's different? And we said we've come up with a solution. It's called red circle, blue line. Red circle is what everybody currently does, or in the main currently does. They do it the old-fashioned way, with no visibility. They keep fixing the same problem. They don't get to the root cause. And we believe we've created a blue line that says we're now going onwards and upwards, and we're doing it with trust, growth, knowledge, data, prediction. And the moment a client slips off the slippery slope and starts saying, yeah, but, we say you're red circling. And as soon as we say we're red circling, we get their attention back on the blue line again. And that's our journey. And that's really what I want to present to you today in terms of how we're doing things differently. Thank you very much.